Hello everyone, I'm reading from Autobiography of Yogi. I'm starting at the bottom of the third paragraph on 294. My eyes filled with tears at his words, but the Swami smiled tranquilly. He reminded me of a little heavenly child sitting securely on the lap of the Divine Mother. The burden of the years has no ill effect on a great yogi's full possession of supreme spiritual powers. He is able to renew his body at will, yet sometimes he does not care to retard the aging process, but allows his karma to expend itself on the physical plane, using his present body as a time-saving device to preclude the necessity of working out remaining fragments of karma in a new incarnation. Months later, I met an old friend, Sanandan, who was one of Parabananda's close disciples. My adorable guru is gone, he told me, amidst sobs. He established a hermitage near Rishikesh and gave us loving training. When we were pretty well settled and making rapid spiritual progress in his company, he proposed one day to feed a large crowd from Rishikesh. I inquired why he wanted such a large number. This is my last festival ceremony, he said. I did not understand the full implications of his words. Pran Abhandandaji helped with the cooking of great amounts of food. We fed about 2,000 guests. After the feast, he sat on a high platform and gave an inspired sermon on the infinite. At the end, before the gaze of thousands, he turned to me as I sat beside him on the dais and spoke with unusual force. Sanandan, be prepared. I am going to kick the frame. After a stunned silence, I cried loudly, Master, don't do it. Please, please, don't do it. The crowd remained silent, wondering at his words. Parambandandaji smiled at me with his eyes, but his eyes were already beholding eternity. Be not selfish, he said, nor grieve for me. I have been long cheerfully serving you all. Now rejoice and wish me Godspeed. I go to meet my cosmic beloved. In a whisper, Pranabandhandaji added, I shall be reborn shortly. After enjoying a brief period of the infinite bliss, I shall return to earth and join Babaji. You shall soon know when and where my soul has been encased in a new body. He cried again, Sananban, here I kick the frame by the second Kriya Yoga. He looked at the sea of faces before us and gave a blessing. Directing his gaze inward to the spiritual eye, he became immobile. While the bewildered crowd thought he was meditating in an ecstatic state, he had already left the tabernacle of flesh and had plunged his soul into the cosmic vastness. The disciples touched his body, seated in the lotus posture, but it was no longer warm flesh. Only a stiffened frame remained. The tenant had fled to the immortal shore. As Sanandan finished his recountal, I thought, the blessed saint with two bodies was dramatic in his death as in his life. I inquired where Pranabandha was to be reborn. I consider that information a sacred trust, Sanandan replied. I should not tell it to anyone. Perhaps you may find out some other way. Years later, I discovered that Swami Keshabandanda from Swami Keshabandanda that Pranabandanda, a few years after his birth in a new body, had gone to Badrinananda in the Himalayas and had joined the group of saints around the great Babaji. Chapter 28. Kashi reborn and discovered. Please do not go into the water. Let us bathe by dipping our buckets. I was addressing the young Ranchi students who were accompanying me on an 8-mile hike to a neighboring hill. The pond before us seemed inviting, but A distaste for it had arisen in my mind. Most of the boys began to dip their buckets, but a few lads yielded to the temptation of the cool waters. No sooner had they dived in than the large water snakes wiggled around them. What shrieks and splashes! What comical hilarity in leaving the pond! We enjoyed a picnic lunch after we had reached our destination. I sat under a tree, surrounded by the boys. Finding me in an inspirational mood, they plied me with questions. "Please tell me, sir," one youth inquired, "if I shall always stay with you in the path of renunciation." "Ah, no," I replied. "You will be forcibly taken away to your home, and later you will marry." Incredulous, he made a vehement protest. "Only if I am dead could I be carried home." But in a few months his parents arrived to take him away. In spite of his tearful resistance, some years later he did marry. After answering many questions, I was addressed by a lad named Kashi. He was about 12 years old, a brilliant student and beloved by all. "Sir," he said, "what will be my fate?" "You shall soon be dead." An irresistible power, it seemed, forced the words from my lips. The disclosure shocked and grieved me as well as everyone else. Silently rebuking myself as an infant terrible, I refused to answer further questions. On our return to the school, Kashi came to my room. "If I die, will you find me where I am reborn and bring me again to the spiritual path?" he asked amid sobs. I constrained to refuse this difficult occult responsibility. I felt constrained to refuse this difficult occult responsibility. But for weeks afterwards, Kashi pressed me doggedly. Seeing him unnerved to the breaking point, I finally consoled him. "Yes," I promised, "if the Heavenly Father lends his aid, I will try to find you." During the summer vacation, I started on a short trip. Regretting that I could not take Kashi with me, before leaving I called him to my room and carefully instructed him to remain, against all persuasion, in the spiritual vibrations of the school. Somehow I felt that if he did not go home, he might avoid the impending calamity. No sooner had I left than Kashi's father arrived in Ranchi. For 15 days he tried to break the will of his son, explaining that if Kashi would go to Calcutta for only 4 days to see his mother, he could then return. Kashi persistently refused. The father finally said he would take the boy away with the help of the police. The threat disturbed Kashi, who was unwilling to be the cause of any unfavorable publicity at the school. He saw no choice but to go. I returned to Ranchi a few days later. When I heard how Kashi had been removed, I entrained at once for Calcutta. There I engaged a horse cab. Surprisingly, as the vehicle passed beyond the Howrah Bridge over the Ganges, the first persons I saw were Kashi's father and other relatives in mourning clothes. Shouting to my driver to stop, I jumped from the cab and glared at the unfortunate father. "You murderer," I cried, somewhat unreasonably, "you have killed my boy." The father had already realized the wrong he had done in forcibly removing Kashi to Calcutta. During the few days the boy had been there, he had eaten contaminated food, contracted cholera, and passed on. My love for Kashi and the pledge to find him after death night and day haunted me. No matter where I went, his face loomed up before me. I began a memorable search for him, even as long ago I had searched for my lost mother. I felt that inasmuch as God had given me the faculty of reason, I would utilize it and tax my powers to the utmost in order to discover the subtle laws by which I could know the boy's astral whereabouts. He was a soul vibrating with unfulfilled desires, I realized, a mass of light floating somewhere amidst millions of luminous souls in the astral regions. How was I to tune in with him among so many vibrating lights of other souls? Using a secret yoga technique, I broadcast my love to Kashi's soul through the microphone of the spiritual eye. the inner point between the eyebrows. I intuitively felt that Kashi would soon return to the earth, that if I kept unceasingly broadcasting my call to him, his soul would reply. I knew that the slightest impulse sent to me by Kashi would be felt in the nerves of my fingers, arms, and spine. Using the upraised hands as antennae, I often turned myself round and round, trying to discover the direction of the place in which I believed he had already been reborn as an embryo. I hoped to receive response from him in the concentration-tuned radio of my heart. With undiminishing zeal, I practiced the yoga method steadily for about 6 months after Kashi's death. Walking with a few friends one morning in the crowded Bao Bazaar section of Calcutta, I lifted my hands in the usual manner. For the first time there was response. I thrilled to detect electrical impulses trickling down my fingers and palms. These currents translated themselves into one overpowering thought from a deep recess in my consciousness. I am Kashi, come to me. The thought became almost audible as I concentrated with my heart radio. In the characteristic, slightly hoarse whisper of Kashi, I heard his summons again and again. I seized the arms of one of my companions, Prakash Das, and smiled at him joyfully. It looks as though I have located Kashi. I began to turn round and round, to the undisguised amusement of my friends and the passing throng. The electrical impulses tingled through my fingers only when I faced toward a nearby path, aptly named Serpentine Lane. The astral currents disappeared when I turned in other directions. Ah, I exclaimed, Kashi's soul must be living in the womb of some mother whose home is in this lane. My companions and I approached closer to Serpentine Lane. The vibrations in my upraised hands grew stronger, more pronounced. As if by a magnet, I was pulled towards the right side of the road. Reaching the entrance of a certain house, I was astounded to find myself transfixed. I knocked at the door in a state of intense excitement, holding my very breath. I felt that my long and unusual quest had come to a successful end. The door was opened by a servant, who told me her master was at home. He descended the stairway from the second floor and smiled at me inquiringly. I hardly knew how to frame my question, at once pertinent and impertinent. Please tell me, sir, if you and your wife have been expecting a child for about 6 months. Yes, it is so. Seeing that I was a Swami, a renunciate attired in traditional orange cloth, he added politely, This is a picture of Kashi. Pray inform me how you know my affairs. When he heard about Kashi and the promise I had given, the astonished man believed my story. A male child of fair complexion will be born to you, I told him. He will have a broad face with a cowlick atop his forehead. His disposition will be notably spiritual. I felt certain that the coming child would bear these resemblances to Kashi. Later, I visited the child whose parents had given him his old name of Kashi. Even in infancy, he was strikingly similar in appearance to my dear Ranchi student. The child showed me an instantaneous affection. The attraction of the past awoke with redoubled intensity. Years later, the teenage boy wrote me during my stay in America. He explained his deep longing to follow the path of a renunciate. I directed him to a Himalayan master who accepted as a disciple the reborn Kashi. Chapter 29. Rabindranath Tagore and I compare schools. Rabindranath Tagore taught us to sing as a natural form of self-expression as effortlessly as birds. Bhola Nath, a bright 14-year-old lad at my raunchy school gave me an explanation after I had complimented him one morning on his melodious outburst. With or without provocation, the boy poured forth a tuneful stream. He had previously attended the famous Tangor school, Santin Nikitan, Haven of Peace, in Bolpur. The songs of Rabindranath have been on my lips since early youth, I told my companion. All Bengalis, even the unlettered peasants, delight in his lofty verse. Bola and I sang together a few refrains from Tagore, who set to music thousands of Indian poems, some of his own composition and others of ancient origin. I met Rabindranath soon after he had received the Nobel Prize for Literature, I remarked after our vocalizing. I was drawn to visit him because I admired his undiplomatic courage in disposing of his literary critics, I chuckled. Bohola, curious, inquired the story. The scholars severely flayed Tagore for introducing a new style into Bengali poetry, I began. He mixed colloquial and classical expressions, ignoring all the prescribed limitations dear to the pundits' hearts. His songs embody deep philosophic truth in emotionally appealing terms, with little regard for the accepted literary forms. An influential critic spitefully referred to Rabindranath as a pigeon poet who sold his cooings in print for a rupee. But Tagore's revenge was at hand. The whole Western literary world paid homage at his feet. He himself had translated into English his Gitanjali, Song of Offerings. A trainload of pundits, including his one-time critics, went to Santin Nikitan to offer their congratulations. Rabindranath received his guests only after an intentionally long delay, and then heard their praise in stoic silence. Finally, he turned against them their own habitual weapons of criticism. Gentlemen, he said, the fragrant honors you here bestow are incongruously mingled with the putrid odors of your past contempt. Is there possibly any connection between my award of the Nobel Prize and your suddenly acute powers of appreciation? I am still the same poet who displeased you when I first offered my humble flowers at the shrine of Bengal. The newspapers published an account of the bold chastisement given by Tagore. I admired the outspoken words of a man unhypnotized by flattery. I went on. I was introduced to Rabindranath in Calcutta by his secretary, Mr. C.F. Andrews, who was simply attired in a Bengali dahoit. He referred lovingly to Tagore as Guru Deva. Rabindranath received me graciously. He emanated an aura of charm, culture, and courtliness. Replying to my question about his literary background, he told me that he had been chiefly influenced by our religious epics and by the works of Vidyapati, a popular 14th century poet. Inspired by these memories, I began to sing Tagore's version of an old Bengali song, Light the Lamp of Thy Love. Bohola and I chanted joyously as we strolled over the Vidyala grounds. About 2 years after founding the Ranchi School, I received an invitation from Rabindranath to visit him at Santiniketan and discuss our educational ideals. I went gladly. The poet was seated in his study when I entered. I thought then, as at our first meeting, that he was a striking model of superb manhood as any painter could desire. His beautifully chiseled face, nobly patrician, was framed in long hair and flowing beard, large melting eyes, an angelic smile, and a voice of flute-like quality that was literally enchanting. Stalwart, tall, and grave, he combined an almost womanly tenderness with the delightful spontaneity of a child. No idealized conception of a poet could find more suitable embodiment than in this gentle singer. There's a picture of Tagore, as he's referring to. Tagore and I soon deepened comparative study of our schools, both founded along unorthodox lines. We discovered many identical features: outdoor instruction, simplicity, ample scope for the child's creative spirit. Rabindranath, however, laid considerable stress on the study of literature and poetry, and on the self-expression through music and song that I had already noted in the case of Baha'u'llah. The Santiniketan children observed periods of silence, but were given no special yoga training. The poet listened with flattering attention to my description of the energizing Yogoda exercises and of the yoga concentration techniques taught to all students at Ranchi. Tagore told me of his own early educational struggles. I fled from school after the 5th grade, he said, laughing. I could readily understand how my innate poetic delicacy would be affronted by the dreary disciplinary atmosphere of the schoolroom. That is why I opened Santiniketan under the shady trees and the glories of the sky. He motioned eloquently to a little group studying in the beautiful garden. A child is in his natural setting amidst the flowers and the songbirds. There he may more easily express the hidden wealth of his individual endowment. True education is not pumped and crammed in from outward sources, but aids in bringing to the surface the infinite hoard of wisdom within. I agreed and added, in ordinary schools, the idealistic and hero-worshipping instincts of the young are starved on an exclusive diet of statistics and chronological eras. The poet spoke lovingly of his father, Devendranath, who had inspired the Santiniketan beginnings. Father presented me with this fertile land where he had already built a guest house and temple, Rabindranath told me. I started my educational experiment here in 1901 with only 10 boys. The 8,000 pounds that came from the Nobel Prize all went for the upkeep of the school. The elder Tagore, Devendranath, known far and wide as Maharishi, great sage, was a remarkable man, as one may discover from his autobiography. 2 years of his manhood were spent in meditation in the Himalayas. In turn, his father, Dwarkanath Tagore, had been celebrated throughout Bengal for his magnificent public benefactions. From this illustrious tree had sprung a family of geniuses. Not Rabindranath alone. All his relatives have distinguished themselves in creative expression. His nephews Gogonindra and Abanindra were among the foremost artists of India. Rabindranath's brother Dwijendra was a deep-seeking philosopher, beloved even by birds and woodland creatures. Rabindranath invited me to stay overnight in the guest house. In the evening I was charmed by a tableau of the poet and a group in the patio. Time unfolded backwards. The scene before me was like one in an ancient hermitage. The joyous singer encircled by his devotees, all aureoled in divine love. Tagore knitted each tie of friendship with cords of harmony. Never assertive, he drew and captured the heart of an irresistible magnetism. Rare blossom of posy blooming in the garden of the Lord, attracting others by a natural fragrance. In his melodious voice, Rabindranath read to us a few of his exquisite poems newly created. Most of his songs and plays, written for the delectation of his students, have been composed at Santiniketan. The beauty of his lines to me lies in his art of referring to God in nearly every stanza, yet seldom mention the sacred name. Drunk with the bliss of singing, he wrote, "I forget myself and call thee friend, who art my Lord." The following day, after lunch, I bade the poet a reluctant farewell. I rejoiced that his little school has now grown to an international university, Visva Bharati, where scholars from many lands find an ideal environment. Where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, where knowledge is free, where the world has not been broken up into fragments by narrow domestic walls, where words come out from the depth of truth, where tireless striving stretches its arms towards perfection, where the clear stream of reason has not lost its way into the dreary desert sand of dead habit, where the mind is led forward by thee into ever-widening thought and action, into that heaven of freedom, my Father, let my country awake. Rabindranath Tagore. Chapter 30. The Law of Miracles. The great novelist Leo Tolstoy wrote a delightful folk tale, The Three Hermits. His friend Nicholas Roerich summarized it as follows. On an island there lived three hermits. They were so simple that the only prayer they used was, "We are thee, thou art three, have mercy on us." Great miracles were manifest during this naive prayer. The local bishop came to hear about the three hermits and their inadmissible prayer, and decided to visit them in order to teach them mechanical invocations. He arrived on the island and told the hermits that their heavenly petition was undignified, and taught them many of the customary prayers. The bishop then left on a boat. He saw, following the ship, a radiant light. As it approached, he discerned the three hermits, who were holding hands and running upon the waves in an effort to overtake the vessel. "We have forgotten the prayers you taught us," they cried as they reached the bishop, "and have hastened to ask you to repeat them." The awed bishop shook his head. "Dear ones," he replied humbly, "continue to live with your old prayer." How did the three saints walk on water? How did Christ resurrect his crucified body? How did Lahari Messiah and Siriyutaswar perform their miracles? Modern science has as yet no answer, though with the advent of the atomic age the scope of world mind has been abruptly enlarged. The word impossible is becoming less prominent in man's vocabulary. The Vedic scriptures declare that the physical world operates under one fundamental law of Maya, the principle of relativity and duality. God, the soul life, is absolute unity. To appear As the separate and diverse manifestations of creation, he wears a false or unreal veil. This illusionary dualistic veil is called Maya. Many great scientific discoveries of modern times have confirmed this simple pronouncement of the ancient rishis. Okay, I'm ending at the bottom of the third paragraph on page 310. Talk to you later. Bye.